Welcome to the Political Philosophy Podcast. I'm Toby Buckle. What is the relationship between fascism and fiction? Why is it so important for leading fascists to lay claim to our fictional universes, to Star Trek, to Tolkien, to things like that? And does the rise of this far-right ideology have anything to do with the creative slowdown in Hollywood and mainstream media? My guest today to discuss all of that is Elia Ayoub, who is someone I've just started following online and wrote recently a really interesting article on this and brought to this conversation some perspectives that kind of got key things clear for me. And it was just a fun conversation. A lot of this we're kind of just chatting about works of fiction that we like and why, and what we think makes certain works of art meaningful and enduring. So, yeah, I really enjoyed this. I hope you do too. This is Fascism and Fiction. I am joined today by Elia Ayoub. Elia, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me.
So, you wrote an interesting essay on the connections between the modern far right and I guess you could say like the impoverishment of fiction and their
hmm
claiming of our fictional universes that I thought was really interesting because I'm not someone who like writes or thinks about fiction at all. I appreciate people who can do that sort of criticism, but it's just not my lane.
hmm
But I've long sort of had a hunch that there's some sort of connectivity between the rise of the modern far right and how shit, essentially, a lot of our modern fiction is becoming. So I thought that might make an interesting podcast episode to talk about. Just to get started, could you maybe give us a sense of where you're coming from in terms of how you view the moment that we're in? So, for instance, for me, I've been pretty clear that I think we're in a global resurgence of fascism. I think we're seeing a radicalizing right everywhere. And I think with some caveats, it's appropriate to call it fascist.
hmm
Um, I'd be interested to sort of know your sort of big picture global perspective before we get into the specifics.
No, I would agree with that. The only thing I would add is that while at the top level it tends to be more on the fascist side, at the ground level it can be a mixed bag. So in the US, for example, you can absolutely have lower C conservatives, so to speak, that are
Mm,
still on the MAGA train, but their own commitment to it varies depending on what they perceive to be their own personal limits, for example, or like red lines or whatnot, which is why Trump's approval rating is lower than it was last time around. Um, so yeah, that's just something I would add, but I would agree with the bigger picture, yeah.
No, I'd agree with that caveat as well. I don't think every single person who voted for Trump is a fascist.
hmm
I think they've clearly reconciled themselves to someone who uses fascist rhetoric, either by thinking, I partially agree with it, it won't be that bad, they don't really mean it.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
think that a lot of the leadership of the movement, a lot of the people in senior positions, you might talk about someone like Stephen Miller in the administration. I think Elon Musk, who we might talk about in this conversation, is a very clear-cut case.
hmm
So it's not that every single person on the right side of the aisle has become fascists. I think more of them have become more radicalized, but it's that the political right, both in the US, the UK, I'm less familiar with EU countries, but certainly France,
hmm
has consolidated under something that I think can reasonably be called fascist.
Absolutely. Germany and Spain as well. Italy, of course, to a large extent as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, do you have a start point for thinking about what fascism is? I mean, I know that's a notoriously fiddly one, academically. I just had Matt McManus on, who's really, confluent in the sort of history and literature of that. But do you have like a go-to definition or way of thinking about it?
Um, Sort of, but one that always feels incomplete to me. Like academically, I can recognize it in the sense that there is an academic literature on it, although even though, as you just mentioned, there are some disagreements, at least on the specifics.
Hmm.
Militarization is a big part of it. Worship of power is a big part of it. A
Hmm.
very specific type of masculinity, which we might describe
Yeah.
as hyper toxic, what have you, even militarized masculinity is a part of it. Fear of the other is a huge part of it. And of course, all of the supremacy related ideologies, which are not necessarily just white supremacy, although historically that's been more or less the dominant one. But you have, like, for example, the Hindutva version, which is not technically white supremacy, but it is a form of supremacy. Um, yeah, those
There's
are
a,
sort
there's
of
a
the,
racial
yeah.
in group. There's a racial in group and an out group.
Yes,
Usually, you're
yes,
talking white for the in group, but there are some variants on
yes,
that.
yes, 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 exactly.
Yeah, I think I'm in a similar place. Like I say, my last interview was with Matt McManus, who does a more sort of academic definition, which I like, and I think we sort of are saying the same thing in just slightly different language. I tend to be more like you in that I just sort of stress recurring themes
Yeah.
like race, masculinity, violence. I'm not sure you can get it down to like a single sentence type thing.
No, I don't think so. And they do have differences between there are differences between the different types of fascism. As
Hmm.
are just as there would be differences between different types of chauvinism or nationalism or ultranationalism rather or what have you.
Or
But
liberalism
they
or
tend to have.
socialism.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. They tend to have more in common than not, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it makes them automatic allies. In fact, sometimes it can make them enemies.
Exactly. I mean, just look at socialist infighting, right?
Yes, exactly.
Like socialism is very clearly a family of things. With that said, there's kind of like some obvious through lines.
Yeah.
Like any form of socialism will be concerned with equality and inequality. And if it just they might understand those in different ways and they might take them in different directions. But if there's not a central concern with equality, like it's probably not really socialist,
Yeah.
And similarly, I would say with fascism, with like masculinity and violence, if it doesn't
Hmm.
focus on violence and a focus on the necessity of violent masculinity, then you're probably more looking at just a strong form of conservatism.
Yeah. 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 Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Agreed.
Um, do you think fascism, as we've sort of covered it, is a good descriptor for the ideology that a lot of, I guess, what we could dismissively call tech pros are slipping into? I think Elon Musk is a prime example, but you covered others in your article.
Yes, I would. I think what's maybe unique about our time is how, um, what's the word I'm looking for? How opportunistic a lot of it is. So
Mm,
in some sense, he could, like, let's say Musk could have, in theory, stuck to a more mild version of MAGA, whatever, without
mm,
going full fascist. But I think different circumstances, whether it's, some people can have educated guesses, but within his personal life, buying Twitter, being in that world, and then kind of going down, further down into that rabbit hole, made him even more of a conspiracy-minded person, more of a paranoid person, more of a hateful person, frankly. That
mm.
essentially what he is putting out there is virtually indistinguishable from fascism, even if one could argue that maybe the intention, and the question of intent is always murky, the intention is maybe not the same as your classic, so to speak, fascists of the 30s. There are more things in common with it than not for it for, in my opinion, to qualify as fascist.
Yeah, I think Elon Musk is just you can never prove intent, and I don't like to get into intent.
Yeah, me neither.
I think if I had to guess, and I realize it's a strong statement, I think Musk is such a clear case. I wonder if he self-consciously identifies as a fascist. Like there's a lot of people who pick up the beliefs, but they wouldn't understand themselves that way. Whereas I
Yeah,
wonder
yeah.
if Musk thinks of himself as a Nazi or something similar in that ballpark, but
I
just
think
thinks
as long as it doesn't look cool or feel good or whatever in whether it's his social circles or what he thinks of it, he doesn't really have much of a social circle, but in terms
mm,
of what he thinks his audience is or whatever, as long as that's not where it's leading, I don't think he will outright call himself that, but he has shared Nazi, literature, so to speak, or memes or whatnot, sometimes semi-ironically, sometimes very much not. That, as I said, in the end, it's almost irrelevant what the intent is because what we know what he wants to do is the end result, which is a white supremacist worldview, which is very fascistic and violent, and othering women and trans people and people of color, and so on and so forth. That plus his wealth makes him, I mean, among others, of course, but into the sort of, in my opinion, pretty dangerous character that he's become.
yeah, 1,000%. So main topic of today,
Hmm.
what is their interest? Perhaps we can start with Musk, but this is by no means unique to Musk.
No.
What is their interest in fantasy universes? Because I wrote a bit about how Musk has developed a bit of a Tolkien obsession. Now, I don't think Tolkien is a fascistic work intrinsically. There've been sort of deconstructions of it.
Hmm.
And nor do I think it's necessarily a liberal work. I think Tolkien's politics are kind of just its own, really. Um, but you could also talk about Plantier, if I'm saying that word right. There's a whole list of examples where the sort of far-right tech bros have been very interested in sort of claiming the language of these fantasy universes. Lord of the Rings is a key example, but they're also really
Hmm.
into sci-fi universes and so
Hmm.
on. Take as long as you want. What's up with that?
So, as someone who is a Tolkien nerd and currently actually rereading Lord of the Rings, and as someone who has watched most of the Star Treks, and I even have a inactive, granted, but a podcast on Star Trek with a friend,
Mm,
um, it's very specific, some of the references that they make, that you kind of have to be in the lore to, not even to get it, because it's actually not that complicated to get. What
mm,
you get from having the sort of, let's say, the knowledge that I have on Lord of the Rings is just recognizing just how wrong they are on a basic level. And that then gives me sort of this window, and I'll explain a bit what I mean,
mm,
to to just ask myself, like, that question that you just asked, what's up with it? Like, why? What's the point of having Palantir as a name? What's the point of having Google's a cluster manager? They called it the Borg, which is like the most evil character in Star Trek almost.
mm.
Zuckerberg's metaverse comes from Ready Player One, which is basically a dystopia.
Yeah.
And I think I mean, obviously, as we mentioned, Musk and his Star Trek thing. Musk was actually a character on Star Trek. He was, I forgot which one it was. I think it was Voyager. No, not Voyager. Sorry, Discovery, one of the recent ones, where he came as well, like as a a cameo, whatever performance. Which Star Trek people are not very happy about, I should say. But there are a number of reasons as to what is up with that. One, I think it's a convenient story in the sense that, like any story, you can sort of take what you want from it. You don't have to be accountable to being textually accurate about your interpretation of Lord of the Rings. You can just do whatever you want. Meloni, the Prime Minister of Italy, is pretty notoriously a Lord of the Rings fanatic as well.
Mm.
When she was younger, she went to this weird neo-fascist the Shire recreation in Italy, like it was a thing. Um, and I mean, Tolkien is a complicated person. Just kind of just put it out there briefly, although it's not the focus of this conversation. But he was pretty explicitly, at the very least, anti-authoritarian, and that's how he viewed
No, no,
himself.
if you want to include an overview of Tolkien's politics in your answer, please do so.
There's an interesting conversation on, I think the podcast is called, I think it was on that one, Everyday Anarchism is the podcast. And he interviewed someone who was like a Tolkien specialist. And the way they describe Tolkien's politics is like a weird mix of lower C conservatism and like socialist libertarianism a la anarchism, by which is meant that he was a traditionalist in many ways. He was pro-monarchy. He was a Roman Catholic. like a true believer in the hierarchy of the Pope and whatnot. But there was something in him, and I think it's referred to, showed mostly in Lord of the Rings itself, that was extremely skeptical about power and especially absolute power, which is why in Lord of the Rings, like the only time the king kneels in the end is to these four hobbits. And the king who ended up being the king is also the guy who didn't really want to be the king and kind of earned his place and all of that stuff. So it's traditional in that stuff, but in that way, I mean, but it allows a bit more um, flexibility, especially in terms of interpretation. Palantir are just seeing eye stones, really. Inherently not necessarily evil, not necessarily good. But what they do, or one of the things that they do, and that's what you see in the movie, is they seduce the user towards power. That's what happens to Saruman, who gets seduced not by Palantir, but by Sauron himself, to go from the good guy to the bad guy, basically in the books and in the movies. And that's what Gandalf, the good guy in the story, I mean, famously in the story, resists and opposes and rejects and describes Saruman's, when ha when has Saruman the Wise abandoned reason for madness? He puts it along those lines. So the Saruman in the story is Palantir, the company, is Peter Thiel, is really that. It's a bit ironic in that sense how on the nose it is, and that's what kind of that's the most thing that got to me, like how transparently on the nose it is to like almost, if you want to call your company Sauron or Voldemort or these kind of famous evil characters in fiction, that there's something odd in what you're doing. And but if you call it Palantir, it's more specific. One of his other companies is called Anduril, which I believe is one of the swords of Aragorn or something like that. But those are very specific. It's like more niche, and I think it's his way. And I mean, I've heard him talk when he's not rambling, which is most of the time. Peter Thiel, he sees himself as an intellectual, and that's what gets to me. Like it's the fact that they're trying to portray a very specific thing, very specific image out there, to project it out there. Elon Musk does the same thing. His knowledge of Star Trek has been kind of debunked online a lot of times, but that doesn't matter. Um, but he really wants people to believe that he's good at so many things, that he's seen so many things, that he's read so many books and all of that stuff. And I don't know if you know this story, but he was exposed by a gamer because he's also supposedly an amazing gamer, is how he wants to project himself to the world, which tells you who his audience is. Very usually young or whatever males and whatnot. Um, but he pretended to have like I forgot which game it is, like an advanced level at a notoriously difficult video game.
Was
I
it
listen.
Diablo, I want to say? I might be making
I
that up.
no idea.
Okay, yeah.
I listened to there's a podcast called QAA, so I can just reference them, where they kind of went into it in they know they've played that game. I don't get it, but he
Mm,
said like he's level 80 something, and then people were skeptical about it and whatever, and so he posted a video of himself playing at that level, and it's only like expert gamers, like gamers who are really good at that game, who notice that he's fake playing. That you wouldn't be doing these moves or whatnot if you were really at that level. And it's shortly afterwards that it was exposed that he paid some guy in Hong Kong like a ridiculous sum of money to get him to that level, which is like it's specific, like you're that rich, you can do so much. You don't have to. No one was asking you to prove that you're that good at that one game, but it felt really important for him to show that he's really good at that game. So there's an element of that when it comes to his supposed like lore of Star Trek, which, as I said, is not very good, or the metaverse in the case of Zuckerberg. Although I don't quite know the specifics of Ready Player One. I just know that the plot. I've seen the movie as well, and it's like a dystopia. But there's something to it, and if you want, we can get more into it. I don't want to kind of derail the conversation too much, but
But I mean, I
it's
think we
yeah.
can note, I don't know the sci-fi stuff at all.
Hmm.
I'm not a sci-fi person. I'm broadly familiar with Lord of the Rings. I'm not someone who's like followed every Tolkien end, no, but
Hmm.
I've seen the films, I've read them, I've read the books as a kid, like so I grew up with Lord of the Rings.
Hmm.
And it's not particularly there was a Musk tweet where he was like, the hobbits need to be protected by I'll just quote him directly, the hard men of Gondor. And um
which is this doesn't happen. It does not happen in the
Which,
story.
you
It's just not
don't
what
need a
happened.
super deep. This isn't like some super when you get into the legendarium and like all the specifics of like. No, 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 no. It's none of that. It's like that's just not the plot of the trilogy. Like the
Hmm.
Hobbit save Gondor, not the other way round.
Yeah,
So I did immediately, I think, have a moment like you said, where I was like, this guy actually doesn't know. I think actually not even doesn't know, doesn't care about
that's the
the
thing. He doesn't care about the specifics, but still it feels important for him to act as though he does. You know, he
okay,
has the
why?
time and money. He has the time and money. He can go and read the book. He can hire a professor to tutor him on the book if he doesn't feel like it. He can do so many things, but he doesn't even do that. I think also he's very lazy. But why does it matter for him for us to know
Right.
or to to perceive him as being that? And I think he wants us to believe that he is a smart person. He's an intellectual, and that's a kind of very specific crop of billionaires, and that's where the tech component of it comes. Because for the longest period of time, they were portrayed in the media, in movies, and in virtually any interview that they've ever had as visionaries.
Hmm.
Sam Altman, there's like entire Instagram account and YouTube accounts now you can follow that just detail how many crazy things he's said. The guy from OpenAI and contradicting himself so many times and saying like I think the most recent thing I saw from like a week or so ago was like there's a decent chance that AI will destroy all of humanity, but in the process we'll have some interesting things, something along those lines.
Yeah.
And you're supposed to take him seriously. And the reason you take him seriously, there's a lot of money involved, there's a lot of critiques that could be made about how tech journalism has kind of abandoned the journalism bit. For the most part, there are exceptions there, and often just again treats these people as visionaries, as inherently visionaries. And we have as a culture, and I'll speak specifically in the UK, and it's certainly true of the US and Canada, as far as I know, basically a good chunk of the world, hasn't really gotten over that hang up, that like seeing these people as visionaries. And I do believe to some extent they see themselves as visionaries. I mean, Musk certainly does.
Hmm.
And Peter Thiel certainly does. And Peter Thiel has even gone into a very more obscure religious fanaticism where he had like this entire long series, like a lecture, which was incomprehensible according to people who were there, on the Antichrist. And he was talking like as a theologian, which he is not. He is not a theologian. But these people have this kind of this apologies to engineer listeners. This is not an engineering problem itself, but it's like a bit of an engineer brain, which is like if we have like or like the binary codes or whatnot, like if you figured out how to code, you figured out how to do tech stuff, you figured out how to run a startup and whatnot. Therefore, and usually it means that you've made a lot of money and you've been praised and culturally you've been given this higher status. Therefore, it means that you know better than a historian, which is why like Musk was angry at Mary Beard some years ago and whatnot, because she said something very basic, which anyone who studies ancient Rome knows, which is A, the concept of race did not exist. There was no such thing as race. And there were, therefore, Romans who were quote unquote of other races, because why wouldn't there? There have been more popes of Syrian origins than popes of German origins, because this wasn't a thing to think of Syria in those terms, for example, at the time. But they don't cope with something like that very well. In the same way that when Musk, his Grok thing, which now is in the news for all of the controversial stuff it's been putting out, when Grok answers truthfully, including when it portrays Musk in a unflattering light, he says, I'm gonna look into this and I'm gonna fix it. And he says these things publicly. That there is a version of reality which cannot be otherwise. Because otherwise, if it does, he can. I think it doesn't take that much of a therapist to see this. That it makes him feel bad. He has to question certain things. He has to do something, and he has the money and influence and a lot of yes men around him and whatnot to have to avoid this, maybe until the day he dies. And Lord of the Rings and Star Trek are universes that are very rich, and there are lots of people in those universes that it's just one of those things that, like, for example, I know that someone can be a Tolkien expert, and I am not a Tolkien expert, but I recognize that person as a Tolkien expert, and it doesn't hurt my identity as a Tolkien nerd because it's about enjoying the universe and it's about getting into the lore, it's about learning the different things and whatnot, and it's an interesting thing to do. Wanting to master that and to rather like to pretend that you have mastered it, like you just know everything about it, is one of those signs that the guy is essentially, excuse the term, bullshitting. And that's what the video gamers were also able to figure out when it came to that specific video game. I can think also of Palmer Luckey, who's the guy from Oculus VR, who's obsessed with the Avengers stories. And there's something also very, I think, culturally, I'm not a huge fan of the Avengers stories, but there's something like culturally impoverished in specifically in US context when it comes to the discourse on these things, that they debate the specifics of superhero films that ultimately were modeled after characters that were targeted. I think Alan Moore put it along those lines, that were targeting like teenagers in the 60s, and we still have those same characters. And in some ways, those men are still those same teenagers, but with a lot of power. I don't want to downplay how dangerous they are. But they're obsessed with seeing themselves as that. So Tony Stark is a fascinating character in and of itself, the guy from the Iron Man, of course, in the Avengers. Um, because he is that. Who is he? There's one of the trailers. You have a Black Widow, I believe, asking him like, "Who are you? What have you done?" And he says, "I'm a playboy, billionaire, entrepreneur." And he says so, which is a very specific. 20, those terms wouldn't be flattering necessarily, like 20 years ago necessarily, or 50 years ago, whatnot. It's a kind of a specific historical moment we're in, and they I don't know what happens psychologically, I can only guess, but the way they talk, whether it's Peter Thiel or whether it's Paul Mulcahy, for example, about militarism, about their role in the military-industrial complex and whatnot, they describe their roles in essentially superpower terms. And I think this is giving them a way out of having to think of those uncomfortable ethical questions that come from, being the person who's selling X amount of weapon to whether it's the Israelis or the Americans or the Saudis or what have you. Um, because in those superhero movies, well, you have a lot of collateral damage. Civilians are killed, but the good guys are the good guys because they know better, because they work outside of the rules. That's a big part of the Avengers. The world government, the UN type is the bad guy, are the bad guys there. Or at the very least, the boring bureaucrats that don't quite understand what is it about us that makes us so special. And these people view themselves as that. They view themselves as very, very special, for the most part men, for the most part white men, although there are also like Brahmin Indian men, in case of Google and whatnot, following the same sort of, same, I don't know, but like similar enough worldview from one another that I do in the same question, in the same, sorry, the same reason we mentioned, let me repeat that. In the same way, at the beginning of this conversation, we asked like who is a fascist and who isn't, that they have more things in common that they don't.
Hmm. Let me add, I want to come back to this idea of cultural impoverishment, but let me add
Yes.
another element to the sort of fascist fiction thing. Is I think there's sort of what you're identifying, which is like in old school fascist terms, like the cult of the Superman,
Yeah.
right? Like the genius visionary leader to whom we must all defer. And, historically, although, still to some degree in the case of Trump, that would be the head of state, the Führer or Mussolini or whatever.
Hmm.
They did that too. I'm thinking of this now. Hitler was always going on about like, oh, my mind is like this massive machine and I think of so many things. And
Yeah.
Hitler, I think, very much was one of these people who always had to demonstrate it wasn't these fictional universe, but demonstrate his mastery of particular fields of knowledge. And
Yeah,
actually,
like he
just
said
thinking
he's
of
an
book.
expert on, sorry, he said that he's an expert on Wagner and in opera and specific types
Yeah,
of literature and stuff like that. Yeah, it was very important for him to portray himself as that as well.
I recently read it's such a strange book, Hitler's Table Talk, which
Mm.
is not all of it because it does go on a bit, but which is he used to have these dinner parties all through the Second World War, where he was the only one who was allowed to speak.
Yeah,
And so people would just come and it would just be this sort of insane rambling monologue for like 2 to 3 hours about whatever was in his head. And but even though he had all the power and, he didn't need to impress anyone, he still very much felt the need to try and show with his monologuing
yeah.
that
That's
he
ironically
really
what
understood all
makes
these
him.
subjects.
That's ironically what makes him human. It sounds like the 1930s equivalent of being addicted to Twitter and then buying it and then changing
It
its
really is,
name.
though.
Yeah,
It
and then changing its
really,
name.
really is.
Yeah.
Um, and even people who, I was sort of reading the foreword to this book, even people who were like both feet in, true believers in the Nazi project, were like, "Ah, I wish the Fuhrer wouldn't do that because he doesn't actually know about any of this stuff and he's making a fool of himself.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
like
Like
some
a
of the
lot of
lieutenants of the regime would be like, I wish
that.
Adolf would shut the fuck up sometimes.
That's why Steve Bannon at one point was really annoyed that Trump was giving so many interviews. He just wanted him to shut up, just do your thing and don't humiliate yourself or whatnot. Although that ended up working fine for Trump.
I do think
Yeah,
there's another. So sorry, that was just prelude. I do think there's another element to it though, which is what you called the colonization of our collective. What did you call it? The colonization
imagination.
of our collective imagination. I
Hmm.
thought a nice phrase. I think there's also an element of fascism which is fantastical in a
Yeah.
way that other ideologies aren't.
Yes.
So all ideologies have an imaginative component to them. Liberalism, socialism are both looking and forward and thinking, what should the future society look like? And that will necessarily involve an element of, to put it bluntly, making stuff up,
Yeah.
right? And there's more and less credible forms of that, I think. Say within socialism, you get some visions that seem like, okay, maybe we can, and some that are like quite nuts. I think what's different with fascism is even the more nuts forms of socialism will attempt, and I say attempt, they're not always successful, but attempt to ground that in something real. Even the really Looney Tunes stuff will say, okay, well, this is based on these laws of scientific historical materialism or whatever.
Hmm.
They'll
Hmm.
try and extrapolate from reality in some way.
Hmm.
Fascism doesn't. Fascism, I think, attempts to extrapolate from a mythic past.
Yeah.
It attempts to, and you saw again with Germany, there was sort of this idea of like, they loved Tacitus and these old myths about the German people and so on.
Oh, and
And
they believe themselves to be also like partly descendant of these ancient Norsemen giants from the north and stuff like that.
yeah,
Like,
and to some degree didn't care if it was true or not. What
yeah.
mattered was that there was a story.
Yeah.
And I think that doesn't care about what's true or not. And you can see that with Musk. Okay, we want to import this white supremacist project into the UK. How do we do that? Well, Tolkien's kind of like a national myth, right? Let's just pick that up and use it. And it's that fascism's always this weird mix of the mythic past and a sort of sci-fi future.
Yeah.
Like you get AI images of like Elon Musk in space on Mars, but
Yeah.
dressed as a medieval knight,
Yes.
which is
Yes.
also very, very Hitler, you know?
Yes.
And I think that's one of the reasons these collective fantastical universes appeal to them, is they don't care. Really, they like to be perceived as smart and having mastered them, but I think deep down it's not important to them whether they're accurately representing them or not. They're a source of imagery for this self-consciously fantastical future that they're projecting forward.
Hmm. I agree. And I think so. If you look at, I think it's two different things when it comes, if, whether it's the Tolkien thing, whether it's the Star Trek thing. In Star Trek,
Mm,
what makes it very, even more, arguably even more absurd in terms of like him calling himself a Trekkie, is that Star Trek is, pretty self-evidently about this bright future where like,
mm,
money is abolished, there is no such thing as poverty, just people have their basic needs met. And there are critiques of Star Trek, it's not perfect, but there are, this is like it's 101. That is the entire thing. Like the original series had a Russian on because it was at the time of the and a Japanese person on, at the time of the Cold War, not too far after the Second World War. And this was Star Trek's way of saying, well, these are the main characters in the stories of the past few decades, and now we're projecting them into like 200, 300 years into the future. And we're beyond all of that. We're beyond racism, we're beyond sexism, well, sexism not quite so much in the original Star Trek, but we're beyond these things. This was at the very least aspiration, and it was pretty open, pretty direct as to like these are the this is the inspiration behind it. There is no such a thing as a billionaire on Star Trek. It is nonsensical. There's no money. How could there be a billionaire? It's a category that does not exist anymore as just as a category for human being and or like an identity or whatnot. Um, it's just something that doesn't work. And yet in his mind, it's like, well, you need to do that because in Star Trek, by the way, if you don't know, there is the dark period, which is actually the 21st century.
mm.
There's like a third world war and like a eugenics war, they call it, two of them or something like that. Like really bad stuff happen, and then
I don't
basically
know Star
humanity.
Trek at all, by the way, so please fill us in.
It's okay. And then basically like humanity figures its shit out roughly in a few decades from our current timeline. And by figuring shit out, I mean like, basically there's a third world war and this is the final one. In the same way
Yeah,
you might think of like the second world war led to the UN, the
yeah,
the third world war led to something more global. And so there's no
yeah.
longer these competing interests and whatnot. And in such a world, you do have ways in for someone like Musk, as in the Musk we know of today, which is that there's still a bit of a romanticization of these great men of history. Star Trek does have that problem. You have like this genius inventor, Singh is his family name. I forgot his first name, who invents the main android Data, who's the one that you see in the Next Generation. Um, who is this amazing character who wants to be human. It's kind of one of those classic stories. But that person, that genius, was also like a very troublesome and troubled character, kind of like, this troubled genius scientist in his lab doing and whatnot. And so Star Trek has allowed for these characters to exist, and this in many ways is a way in for a character like Trump. Well, Trump, if he cared about Star Trek, but like Musk, you know? But it doesn't work in the sense that if you call yourself a Trekkie and you believe that there is an ethos to this universe, which there is, and is very apparent, it's like on the nose, then you can't be a racist. You can't be a white supremacist. Every season of virtually every Star Trek series talks about these evil ideologies of the past, and they would be talking about fascism and racism and authoritarianism and whatnot. And the single most cartoonishly evil character or like species rather, in Star Trek is the Borg, which is this huge cube-like um, civilization effectively that has a Borg queen, and otherwise, like, an ant colony, and otherwise everyone has the same thoughts. And they don't, you hear all of the other thoughts at the same time, very like 19 or like not maybe more Brave New World-esque. And that the Borg is what Google called its cluster manager. You have like the lessons sometimes are obvious, but it's what we have been getting at already. Like something interesting happens at the level of power, that those people who are in power today, when they then consume these media, or maybe these media is already in them from before they became in power, whatever it might mean, because they're also like signifiers at the cultural level. Virtually everyone at the very least has heard of Lord of the Rings and Star Trek and what have you. It gives them a way in. It gives them a way in with an imaginary audience, whether it's real or not. It gives them a way in the sense that the aesthetics could be plucked out of the universe, and you can ignore the story or the morale because you would have to read the book, and they don't want to do that. But if you don't care about that, well, you have Aragorn, a very cool sword. He looks nice. His partner is a very attractive elf woman, and Gandalf, cool beard, and he has a staff, and they beat up the bad guys. You don't have to think too much about the morale of it all, the story of it all. Like, who are these people? Why did Gandalf come back from the dead? Or why is it two hobbits ultimately in the end that made the entire difference? One of the one of the things in the book that you don't have in the movies is a character called Tom Bombadil that you see in the beginning of the
Mm.
book, and there's a separate book on him as well. And he's sort of like this god figure in the sense that he was there at the beginning of time. He's sorry. In the sense that he was there at the beginning of time. He's not affected by these things. And notoriously or infamously, whatever, he's the only character in the entirety of the entire Lord of the Rings series that we know of, at the very least the books, where he is unaffected by the ring. In the
Mm.
sense that the ring does not appeal to him whatsoever. And that's because he doesn't have this quest for power. He doesn't have this desire for power anywhere in him. And he's the only character in at the very least these three books that has that. Even Gandalf doesn't dare touch the ring because he said through him something evil would come out. And Galadriel, the elf queen or whatever the title is, also doesn't. And it's a hobbit, a mere hobbit, and his gardener that end up withstanding the evil of the ring. And most importantly, Sam, the gardener, is the real hero of the story because Frodo actually would have fallen. Like
Mm.
Gollum, Smeagol, who became Gollum, did before him, like Bilbo almost did, his uncle who gave him the ring. But Frodo kind of did almost fall a few times, and it's his gardener, Sam, who's this pure at heart, very innocent hobbit who just wants to go back home and marry this woman that he's been in love with his whole life and wants to garden because he's a gardener and loves cooking and loves smoking and loves drinking and partying and dancing and what hobbits do. And it's thanks to this gardener that the One Ring that is supposed to control everything and that the evil Dark Lord, sorry, Sauron wants to get back at any cost. It's thanks to this gardener that the ring is actually destroyed in the end. And that is the point of Lord of the Rings. That's the point of the even the title, who is the Lord of the Rings? There can only be one Lord, Sauron.
Mm.
And you cannot share that power. If you think you can, if you're Saruman and if you think you can, you get called madness, like you've gotten mad. You've madness has afflicted you, whatever Gandalf tells him. And then
Mm.
Saruman lost. So it's like if you let this seduce you, you fall. That's the story. And the people who did not let it seduce them, like Boromir did, and he ended up dying, then he regrets it, but just before dying. Aragorn did not, and that's why he is the hero. Frodo almost did, but then Sam helps him, etc., etc. And it's the fellowship of the ring. There are no billionaires in a situation like that. It's a
Mm.
fellowship. It's these diverse characters, literally like four hobbits, one dwarf, one elf, one wizard, and one and two men
Mm.
that are doing this thing together. They come from different parts of the world. They've been brought to the to Rivendell by the count by Elrond, and there's the Council of Elrond, and he said, "Okay, who is going to do this?" And they decide these are the nine companions to go through the mission to the end. It's a story about communal, like they have to work together, they have to share resources, they have to listen to one another, trust one another, even in their darkest moments. And when they're split up, well, a part of those, two of them gets kidnapped, the hobbits, and then the other three follow them to try and rescue them, while the two hobbits, the main hobbits that we know of, go to continue on their path to Mount Doom. But even then, they cannot destroy it entirely once they get to the last point. Were it not for the fact that you had the survivors, willing to sacrifice themselves to draw out the attention of Sauron, and that's when they march to the gates of Mordor, in order to give time for Frodo and Sam, who are by then closer to Mount Doom where the ring will be destroyed, to give them time to destroy it, and so that the eye of Sauron is fixated on them, on Gandalf, on Aragorn, on Legolas and Gimli and the others. And that's what happens. That's how it was destroyed. Frodo couldn't have done it on his own. Sam couldn't have done it, obviously, and none of the others could have done it. It had to be all of them together for something like this to happen. And then the king, the return of the king, the kind of the aesthetics that they love in the end, his first act as king is to kneel before these four hobbits, who are the ones, especially two of them, who are the ones who have saved Middle Earth. So it's not the hobbits being saved by the brave men of Gondor.
The
The brave
hard
men
man.
of
Oh,
Gondor,
oh.
the Gondor men kind of failed, and the Rohan men also failed for a long time. But it's the Hobbit in the end that ended up, winning, and that's just because they had love with one another. Those two Hobbit men, are
Mhm.
the ones who pulled it through because they had one another. Frodo wanted to go on his own, and Sam refused because he had promised to Gandalf to follow Frodo. Where's the billionaire in all of this? Where's the story of the entrepreneur and it doesn't work. But if you only care about the aesthetics,
Saruman, maybe.
Saruman, exactly, yeah. But he's the bad guy. But
Saruman's your
you're
But,
not
but
supposed to
he's the
think of him as
Musk
the bad guy.
analog, right?
Yeah,
I thought this. It's Saruman is Musk in
yeah,
that you've got a sort of industrialist who kind of lost his mind and threw it
exactly.
in with the evil forces, and then kind of sort of turned against the evil forces and ended up with nobody liking them.
Yeah,
That's the Musk arc,
yeah,
isn't it?
yeah, yeah. If you only focus on the aesthetics, you have, these evil, and this is where Tolkien does get problematic, like these evil creatures from the west, from the east rather, attacking the men of the west. Just focus on that. Focus on west and east. Focus on those two terms. And then it becomes much easier if you're someone like Musk.
But
So
I
yeah,
think the thing with fascists is they don't care. They
no,
don't care what they're saying's true.
no,
Like it
no.
doesn't matter. And if you say, oh, well, that's the wrong read of Lord of the Rings, well, then fuck you, you know?
Yeah, then you're just wrong and I'm right because he cannot be wrong anyway.
You used a phrase earlier, the impoverishment of our culture.
Yeah,
What does that all tie in? Because I'm not someone who's going to sit around and complain that people watch too many. Look, people can like what they like, right? I'm liberty principle liberal. I'm really not into dictating someone's
sure,
perspective.
sure. Me neither.
With that said, there's clearly been a shift. So one statistic that I think went in my head is if you look at the top 50 films of the 90s, only five were sequels.
Mm,
And then if you look at the top 50 films of the last decade, only five weren't, or
yeah,
connected to
yeah,
other IPs in some sort of way. Well, and again, I don't want to get too prissy about this. Plenty of bad films are originals and plenty of good films are sequels.
of
With
course.
that said, there does seem to be a lack of originality, a homogenization of everything that goes beyond simply individual tastes, that speaks to something that perhaps has gone long in the culture of elites.
Hmm.
How does that piece, I mean, I think we all notice this thing, right? How does that piece tie into all this?
So it's a number of things. As you said, there are amazing sequels. Toy Story comes to mind.
Mm,
And I mean, a lot of things. There are movies, there are sequels, and that's fine. In and of itself, it's not a problem. And there are amazing things being produced today. So in and of itself, it doesn't mean that everything got worse, of course. But in terms of a trend, in terms of a dominant trend, on the investor side, there is much less of a willingness, and there are various reasons for that. I don't know all of them. There's less of a willingness to explore and to kind of be the one who's willing to take the risk and do a Toy Story 2, let's say, or whatever it might be. And if you see something really work, like Stranger Things, the first season works well in the sense that it's very popular. So you do a second and a third, and I think there's a fifth one at some point, and then you do a musical, and then you have merch and whatnot. And in and of itself, that's not new. But the final product being merchandise, the final product being effectively advertisement, has taken over, as in the sense that you're creating the thing in order for it to become merchandise, in order for it to become adaptable in different things, whether musicals or whatnot, which again, in and of itself is not the problem, but it does mean that the storyline is not as big of a thing. It's not that important. And that's part of why these people, especially, are so obsessed with AI. It's in a way this way of replacing the artist, which you can't do because you need the artist in order to harvest the data in the first place. But it's a
It
way
seems
of.
to me like
Mhm.
AI, at least in this space, is almost like a continuation of that trend. Because
Yes, it is.
the trend I'm talking about predates AI. But
Yes.
AI, even when it works and it doesn't give you janky, weird, or broken stuff, but even when it does what it's supposed to do, it's going to homogenize and harmonize, right? You
Yes.
ask it, give me X, it's going to go and find a bunch of instances of when people have done X and kind of like give you the average of them. Which, I don't want to be like a complete Luddite about AI. I can see uses for that, but at the same time, it just does continue this trend into evening everything out and sanding
Yes.
all the corners off and having everything just be iterations of something else, you know?
Hmm. So I will gently push back on the term Luddite. It's one of those terms being reclaimed. I would recommend a book by Brian Merchant, Blood in the Machine. That's very good on that. But
Mm,
that said, um, it's about thinking of the final product, like what you want. If you're someone if you imagine these execs who wants to just maximize profit for and minimize the cost of making the thing, AI is almost this perfect promise. Of course, it
yeah.
doesn't actually work, and there's very, very multiple reasons as to why this cannot just happen in the same way, and among which, and maybe the most important factor, being the human element. The Lord of the Rings, again, just because we've been talking about it, it's also the fact that people got to know these actors and there's all of these behind the scenes and these kind of laws about, oh, did you know that when Aragorn kicks it's one of those funny memes, when Aragorn kicks the helmet of one of the orcs I believe in the second film or whatnot, and he yells, the reason why he yells is because Viggo Mortensen actually broke his toe while
Mm.
doing so. So he actually is yelling. And so it just becomes this thing that there's improvisation. You can't always plan it ahead of time. There is the role of the director, the role of the writer, the role of the screenwriter, the role of the costume department, music, and all of it coming together is what makes this enjoyable. You can't just skip that. It doesn't work in the same way in the sense that like you won't have a huge audience that finds that appealing. And most importantly, you don't have a long-term cultural resonance. But this is why AI is a bit of a shortcut for these people because they don't care about long-term cultural resonance. It's about now. It's about getting either maximizing profit now or trying to be on top of things now or trying to get ahead of certain contracts with the US government or whatever it might be or trying to convince investors that your thing is ChatGPT 700.2 or whatnot is going to be the real thing after 700.1 hasn't quite worked out in the same way. That AGI, this magical thing is coming, it's around the corner, it's just coming, it's coming, it's coming. And this culturally fits very well with this notion that something is coming. something is coming, you see it in post-apocalyptic fiction, or something has come in that case, like a really bad event has happened, and now we're in the post-apocalyptic. Or something is coming is part of millenarian tradition, including the Christian tradition. The Messiah is coming, etc., etc. And it allows a lot of these people to sort of, especially those who are not rich, I would say, like maybe let's say the lower ranks of that entire world, to see themselves as part of something greater than themselves, which is
Mm.
ironic because the ideology that they are subscribing to is inherently anti-human. Doesn't actually see them as part of something greater than themselves. Sees them as just individuals at best, workers at best, unless you're able to get at the top, you know? And so you're able to take these stories but and kind of conclude the thing that you want to conclude from it. It doesn't have to have anything to do with the original intentions of your Tolkien or Roddenberry, the founder of the creator of Star Trek, or what have you. It doesn't have to. The culture impoverished, just to go back to that specifically,
Mm.
there's even a term for it. I forgot what it is. There was an interview recently, and they were talking about how even Netflix has these entire series being churned out with the knowledge that people are going to be on their phones while
Mm.
watching these series. And what this means is that this TV series itself doesn't matter. What matters is that it's configured and it's optimized, the term that they love, of course, optimized to keep your attention, especially if your attention is already fragmented. So it's not about the storyline. It's not about like, oh, this is the desire of the artist to change the world, or at the very least change the reader or the viewer or what have you, and instill in them some kind of new experience or whatever it might be, or maybe like in Tolkien's case, like this is my morality, this is how I view the world, and I think there's something to it, or what have you. Or in Star Trek's, it's like this is how the future could be. The future could be good, and then the specifics of that and whatnot. You can skip all of that. It's about just like how can I keep the attention of the person who's usually on their phone or on their laptop, iPad slash screen, like TV or all of the above sometimes, and just at the very least convince them to keep it in the background because that's the business model. This Netflix CEO, I believe, said something like one of his primary competitors is other channels as well as sleep. You know, like people go to sleep, which means that they're not on Netflix. So that's the end goal. And if that's the end goal, then the medium will be optimized for that as the end goal. So that's how it's by default impoverished. It's not about getting into the, as I said, this world building and kind of getting lost maybe in the characters or whatever it might be. And usually for that to really work, in order to get lost in the characters, those characters have to have some kind of commonality with one another, some kind of link with one another, and including like communal links. And that's why like people end up identifying with certain worlds. Like I really feel like I belong there or whatnot, like in a really deeply emotional way. Like it really resonates in that sense. But you can skip all of that if you're thinking about AI or even before it in terms of the there's probably a word for it, but what I've been calling like the impoverishment of that, but the specific type of culture.
Can I add another element to the impoverishment of fiction thing?
Mm-hmm.
And this isn't my field at all, but it's just sort of a thought I've had. In that what you've seen in a number of sort of projects and franchises is the self-conscious removal of values from them. That
Yeah.
doesn't leave them without values, but it leaves them. Well, let me give you a couple of examples. So, another big fantasy franchise we haven't touched on would be the Game of Thrones, which I do know a little bit. I watched
Mm-hmm.
all TV and I've read, I think, all but the last book. I eventually got
Mm-hmm.
bored with them. Um, but I think I share the consensus opinion that the TV series started okay, had some pretty good seasons, and then ended pretty poorly. I
Yeah,
think
I
everyone's pretty
agree.
much agreed on that now. The one thing that infuriated me, I mean, I think we all agree the showrunners were okay at adapting the material, but not writing it, and that
Yeah.
was the core problem. I'd point to another problem, which is there was this quote they had, which I just sort of went, yeah, that's what went wrong, where they said, and I quote, themes are for book reports.
Mm-hmm.
Like they wanted good dialogue, they wanted good characters, they wanted big, set pieces or whatever. But the idea that the project of this entire thing was something that was trying to say something or that had values was an idea that they self-consciously rejected.
Yeah.
And I just thought, okay, well, that's what's went wrong. Because the Song of Ice and Fire does have values. It does have themes in
Hmm.
George R. R. Martin's work, certainly. I'm not sure how explicit they are, and I'm not even sure really to what extent they're intentional. But there's clearly a theme around, for instance, the nature of power. I think
Hmm.
Martin's particular view of what power is that I disagree with, incidentally, but it's there, it's a theme,
Yeah.
right?
That you can engage
And
with.
yeah, and you can sort of, there's a vision of what politics is there. There's a self-consciously, I think, realpolitik view where he both hasn't, and again, this was would be something I would critique in Martin. I think Martin hasn't really understood what the tradition of political realism is, and he's kind of like almost just taken the top notes from a surface reading of Machiavelli. But anyway, it's there. There's a theme.
Hmm.
What you get in the last few seasons is they're like, okay, we don't care about themes, but obviously there still are themes, and what you end up with is a sort of aggressive centrism. Like the what you end up with is a statement. What the whole project ends up saying is the type of politics represented by Daenerys is bad and malicious, and when people come along saying we're going to radically change the world for better, you need to distrust them.
Yeah.
That's sort of what it ends up saying,
Yeah.
which I don't think is quite what Martin was going
Yeah.
for. But but I don't think they meant it to say that. Or the sort of strong authoritarian represented by, say, Cersei, that's also a dead end. What you
Hmm.
need is sort of the mild-mannered centrist. Now, I don't
Yes.
think they meant to say that, but I think that just was their politics, and I think that was what came through.
I agree.
But it's also a very vacuous politics
Yeah.
where the way you win the game is by not doing anything or believing in anything. Anyway, that's my critique of Game of Thrones. Another example would be, and I'm sort of going off on one here, the Jurassic Park franchise, where
Hmm.
the first movie had obviously is now remembered for pioneering CGI. This is sort of an awesome summer blockbuster in its own right, but also had a really interesting running dialogue about the nature and desirability of progress.
Yeah. They didn't they
People,
didn't they didn't stop to ask the question of why. They only asked how, but not why. One of the dialogues.
yeah, and you also have lines like Malcolm in it says, "Why do you assume progress is a good thing? It is a violent, penetrative act." That's a hell of a line to have in a kids'
Yeah,
movie,
yeah.
you know? Um, Now, all of its sequels try to redo the moments. Oh, we'll redo the Rex scene. We'll redo the awe and wonder at the dinosaur scene. But without ever having a sense of, I don't think at any point in any of the sequels there was a question of what are the values of this movie and what is it trying to say.
Hmm.
And they all fall flat because of that. You
It's the
know?
same that happened with Stranger Things. In the beginning, it was about these kids coming together and helping this being and whatnot. But then at some point, the theme, or rather the aesthetics, actually, not the theme, the aesthetics became what the I think producers assumed most people related to the most. Kind of 80s aesthetics, like there's no internet yet. Very much romanticized view of the 80s, but all of that, and people coming together and playing D&D and all of that stuff, and they went with it. And then the aesthetics became more about like the colors of it all. That's why like there is a musical now that's really about the colors, among other things, in the West End in London. And
And
it's
I
no
don't
longer
want to
about
say,
this theme in the same way.
yeah, I don't want to say there's not political art anymore. There clearly is. So you could talk about something like Parasite, which won the Best Picture, right? That
Hmm.
very, very clearly and overtly is sort of a critique of capitalism and the class structure and blah, blah,
Hmm.
blah.
Hmm.
That's trying to say something, right?
Yeah.
But it seems like we have two things now. We have capital P political movies, which are kind of more indie and like that's a niche thing for a niche audience, like Parasite. And then we have the blockbuster movies that are trying very hard not to have values. I
Yeah.
say try because I don't think you can ever not have values, but the result of trying not to have them is you end up with less good values and less coherent values. I think the idea of like big blockbuster mainstream art trying to say something, again, I think the original Jurassic Park's a good model of
Hmm.
that.
Hmm.
That seems to have just gone completely. Like
Yeah.
the idea that like, Well, like the Terminator is trying to say some quite relevantly now, right? In the age of AI, is trying to say something.
Yeah.
And then all of the sequels just sort of riff off the aesthetics and the moments and the key scenes, but without any conceptual underpinnings. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think this is what I mean. Like I also gave the example of how you have Star Wars Andors, which is an exception to this. And
Mm.
so you do have exceptions, but I mean, notably, it's not 10 seasons either. You know, it's two or
Yeah.
three, whatever. It's like not a lot. Um, so there are exceptions, and these could resonate as well. Like it went viral, like a lot of people watched it. It's a very huge, popular series and whatnot. But it tends to be the case this tends to not be the case. There's a hope in me that like if they see, the rich people who are investing in all of that stuff see that something like Andor works, then maybe they can invest in something else. I don't know. But usually the type of story that you do see in like a Star Wars Andor, where like quite literally you have an uprising by a lot of like working class and diverse folks like and whatnot against this authoritarian um, monarch type empire. Um, y- I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. Yeah, usually that sort of storyline is what you would see in more like indie films or maybe something that you might see on the Criterion channel or maybe a classic of some type or whatnot, where like there was much more focus on like what is the story, what is the thing, what at the very least, what is the thing, what is the emotion I want to evoke in my viewer, or what is it I want my viewer to get out of this or whatnot. That there is more of this intent, to go back to that topic. And I completely agree that the more this is sort of stripped away, the more we're likely to see something that sort of resembles what an AI would produce without AI actually being involved necessarily.
Yeah, yeah,
Like
yeah.
it is this kind of lower common denominator. What is the thing that's most likely to work? I don't know, the people in power or whatever it might be. We can't be too blatant about who the bad guys are or something like that. And so if they're doing it well, they will find some very interesting metaphor and whatnot. But if they don't, which these days tends to be the case, they'll just focus on the aesthetics. They'll just focus on like what is this thing, what is it, what's the vibe, as the term is these days, of this. Because again, with the assumption and a lot of the time that the people who are going to consume
Mm.
this TV series or usually it's a TV series or movie or whatnot are not paying attention that much either. So it's kind of a problem on both sides, on multiple sides, I would say, if that makes sense.
What I think you're possibly more optimistic than I am about the possibilities of art and fiction as a liberatory practice.
Hmm.
I don't know. I sometimes just think we've had this is something people have said. I don't know quite if I agree with it or not, but I'm like maybe 60% in agreement without having thought about it too much. People say, well, we have all these movies like Star Trek, Star Wars, where it's sort of, there's a sort of vaguely sort of anti-fascism to Star Wars,
Sure.
the rebels against the big goose-stepping empire.
Hmm.
These are all the things we grew up with and like have informed our collective con. It doesn't seem to have mattered. Like the bad guys in our age are just like, yeah, we're the fucking empire, deal with it. And it doesn't, even the sort of art that we're harkening back to, and perhaps we're just being old fogies here, but like the art that we're harkening back to that did have values, I like more. I think it makes it better art. I'm not sure it's made I'm not sure it's made much of a difference or acted as like a warning to people. Um, I don't know. And like, people always point to great, if you think about like art, people would go to like, I don't know, Picasso's Guernica or something. Great sort of, so yeah, it's a beautiful painting. I've seen it. It's great. General Franco did not stand of that in front of that painting, wipe a single tear from his eye and say, no, pull it all off, folks. I sometimes get a bit, I think we can say art changes the world as a bit of a banality sometimes.
I
But
think art,
I
yeah.
go for it. Tell me I'm wrong.
It's not that. I think it can. I don't think it does necessarily.
Mm.
For me, like my answers on these things are always like there are multiple tools that are needed, and I
Yeah, yeah.
wouldn't underestimate any of them. Like if it wasn't important, it wouldn't be important for someone like Musk to pretend that he's a Trekkie.
Mm.
It wouldn't matter at all for someone like Peter Thiel to also code his billionaire empire in some kind of weird Christian pretending to be a theologian and also pretending to have fully understood Lord of the Rings or whatnot. It wouldn't matter to these people as much if it didn't have a cultural resonance. That doesn't mean that like just by reading Lord of the Rings or watching Star Trek or what have you that you'll come out of it changed necessarily, but
Yeah.
it is part of the tools that a lot of people will use to be to be inspired. It can be something that people who, especially in organizing spaces, and that's been my experience, struggle a lot with like, what's the point of this? We keep on losing. And ultimately, if that's the conclusion that we reach, where we will just it does become a self-fulfilling prophecy in that sense. Which isn't to say that like what we need to do is to get a lot of potential union members to watch Andor and they will just get it. It's not that.
Yeah.
But it is about like making it easier to think about these things in the same way that as we now, like a lot of people stop thinking, at the very least at the discourse level, at the media level, about global warming. What we've been seeing instead for the past decade plus is this huge proliferation of post-apocalyptic movies. It's like they're trying to speak to that without speaking to it, and usually doing a pretty bad job at it, I would say, for the reason you mentioned, trying to be the centrist and like depoliticizing global warming of everything. Um, but it's still important to like one of the examples I gave in an older piece I wrote in 2022, I believe, calling like what if we cancel the apocalypse is what I called it
Mm.
for New Lines magazine. And I give the example of a lot of very young kids today, as was indeed in my case, and I'm gonna turn 35 this year. When I was a kid, like let's say 30 years ago, I had a lot of like post-apocalyptic imagery in mind in terms of like zombies and the living dead of different types and whatnot. And then as I became more like 10 years later, more in my teens and whatnot, that's when the climate stuff happened, like the day after tomorrow, all of that stuff. And then the post-apocalyptic movies like The Walking Dead, iRobot, all of that stuff, um, in different ways. What that has done unintentionally, I think probably for the most part, but what that has done is that it's also saturated what we automatically think of as the future, how the future would look like. And we're always wrong when we think of what the future would look like because literally none of us know. We
Mm.
have certain ways of predicting in the sense of like what is the most likely scenario, but then the only one major thing has to happen for that the scenario to be completely upended, you know, for better or worse, not necessarily even for better. And the role of fiction in that case is to contribute to to populating that imaginary with stories, hopeful stories, not just like, oh, we're kumbaya kind of stories, but like concretely stories of people coming together and having a plot where you can follow the characters. And also, as I said, that's one of the reasons why a lot of things is still so relevant in that sense. And why you're able to also revisit it here and there at your different types, different stages of your life. And that's what makes it um, that's part of why it becomes culturally resonant, that people are able to revisit it after 10 years, after 20 years, after 30 years. And it's only after a very specific period of time, like let's say a generation or two, that it's cemented as like something that has influenced an entire generation, which usually you don't get to realize in the moment. So we don't quite know like how if something like Andor is very popular, we don't quite know how is this going to influence people on the ground. We know that, for example, the Hunger Games, there is the three finger salute that they use in the Hunger Games that has been reused in protests in, I believe, in Southeast Asia. I think Indonesia is one of them. And so that this is kind of an example of something being, and in the end maybe more about the aesthetics even than the story, right? Like it's not like they're sitting while protesting in unfair government and debating the plots of Hunger Game and how it could be interpreted best and whatnot, but there is a certain aesthetics to it that can be used in this case against the powerful. Lord of the Rings could be used in both ways, against the powerful and for the powerful, as we've been talking about. And I think it's kind of like a challenge in some sense. As someone, I see myself as I used to be an organizer, now I'm more of like on the creative side of things. How do I link those two? And I can give you a concrete example. Like I was, I one sec. I became friends with a scientist called Julia Steinberger, who teaches at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. And she's a climate scientist, and she's one of the lead authors of the IPCC. Um, she is the one who, after I interviewed her on my podcast, she's the one who then organized a number of panels that I attended, in which we were trying to basically bridge the gap between climate science and climate discourse, because those are two different things.
Mm.
And when it comes to climate science, it cannot be clearer. It's very straightforward what the problem is. We know it's about emissions, we know it's about deforestation. It's boringly clear in that sense what the problem is and what we need to do and whatnot. When it comes to climate discourse, there's a complete disconnect. It's about we cannot do too much. We cannot change too quickly. We have to be quote unquote realist. They love using that term. The big oil execs, the head of COP28, the UAE guy who's also the oil guy in the UAE. He said like I'm an energy realist is the term that he uses. And the real in this is what I would like to kind of dismantle because it's still relying on a certain worldview and certainly projecting a certain worldview of what is considered possible and most importantly, what's considered not possible at all. You cannot, it's impossible, it's completely inconceivable to think about not prioritizing GDP. It's completely inconceivable to think about housing everyone. It's just beyond the realm of possibility. But we have AI, and suddenly trillions of dollars are available, and we're able to invest in them and all of that stuff because it fits a certain worldview, and of course, because it benefits people in power. And I would like to kind of contribute to widening that gap in that sense, if that makes sense. I would like for people, well, one of the things I would like to do more and more is to think of how to make the unrealistic, what feels unrealistic, how do we make it feel more realistic? Because in both cases, it's about an interpretation and it's about among other things, but it's about an emotional reaction to to how we perceive the future. I don't know if that makes sense.
It does. No, I like that answer. I think that's much more grounded.
Hmm.
It's to paraphrase, it's a tool in the toolkit. It's not
Yep.
the only tool, but
No,
you'd be worse off without the tool.
that's the
I think.
thing. You need
Yeah,
people
no,
who
no, I
are,
like that answer because
you need people
I
who are a
do
bit,
think,
yeah, please
and we
go.
all do this. This isn't just artists. I do
Mm,
think artists can sometimes make the claim that theirs is the tool. And I think we all
sure,
do that. Like the
sure.
thing we're doing is the most important thing. I think we all do that. And I sort of instinctively call like art is the thing that will lead to liberation. I think I sort of instinctively call bullshit on that.
Sure.
But I think what you're pointing to is there's a danger of taking that sort of, I think, justified skepticism too far and saying that it has no political value. That's clearly not true either. I mean, I'll give you an example from my own work. I just had a big piece out with the New Republic, which was like interviewing loads and loads of voters around this idea of Cassandras, people who sort of saw it coming early and weren't
Hmm.
listening to.
And we believe,
And
yeah.
I found myself talking about Jurassic Park a lot
Mm,
to bring it back to that, because I thought, Malcolm is a really good portrayal of a Cassandra. The person
yeah.
who's like, well, clearly this isn't a good idea. And everyone's like, oh, you're being silly. Anyway, on to the T-Rex, right? And it was something that resonated with a lot of the people I talked to. I talked about it a bit in the article, and it was something people liked. And I sort of was in two minds about it at the time. I was like in this big, serious piece that I've spent months working on and like whatever, and that like dozens and dozens of people have contributed to. Am I going to spend 3 paragraphs on Jurassic Park? Right? And like in the end, it's like, yeah, because that's something that is a cultural touch point that everyone has access to. Once I
That's the
get
thing.
into that, everyone knows what I mean. And it's a good one because it's not something vacuous that I'm repurposing. Jurassic Park is clearly, I think, intending to say something a bit like what I'm trying to say in that article. And it lands because of that. And, back in
Yeah,
the day, that would be like, Bible stories or whatever. Like, there's
exactly.
a that even writers who seemed maybe not atheists, but fairly secular, drew a lot from Bible stories was because
Yeah,
that was the language their audience had access to.
yeah,
And you
yeah,
don't see that anymore. Like no one, I think, is even people who really claim to be Bible thumpers. I don't think really anyone is that biblically fluent, apart from like a handful of people
sure.
are like that biblically fluent anymore. What we have is Jurassic Park and Star Trek and Star Wars. These are and Tolkien actually. These are our sort of scriptures,
Hmm.
in modern day. And it
Yeah,
does, they serve a similar role to scripture in the, you see this certainly with the Bible. A liberal will come along and say, oh, that overturning the tables in the temple, that seems pretty socialist. And a conservative will come along and pick up something else.
yeah.
Like, yeah, it's one tool in the toolkit. I think that's a good ground.
and it's one which
Yeah.
I don't think we can afford to give up to the other side, if that makes sense. It's one of those
Yes.
things that like ultimately what Trump would love most in the world, let's say, is for whatever he says to just be, to just become reality, to just people around him. There's no such thing as disagreement with him or anything like that. Musk is very much along those lines as well. And Musk is the closest person to have kind of made that a reality in some sense because he bought the thing that was the echo chamber. He bought it
Yeah.
for himself to have his own echoes. Um, and it is clearly something that still, let's say, bothers him, for example, that we're able, like people like me, are able to point out that this is just wrong. Because otherwise, he wouldn't really be bothering with it. Now, me pointing it out doesn't change who he is, but it does
Yeah.
have a bit more of a chance of persuading other people who may be more, let's say, keen on just believing him 100%. That's what happened with those gamers at the time. These are people are like the easiest, I mean, not to stereotype, unfortunately, there are amazing gamers out there, but like they've been among the easiest people to recruit to that side of politics,
Mm.
especially after Gamergate and the whole misogyny stuff and whatnot. Um, the fact that they're able to sort of see, because they have their own code of ethics in some sense, you're not supposed to cheat, you're not supposed to pretend that you're not who you are and whatnot, you're supposed to kind of follow the rules of the game and whatnot. They're able to call out the person who's not doing that, regardless of how rich the person is. Because when you're playing that game, you are just a player. You
Yeah.
cannot be the billionaire in that situation. Doesn't make sense. And I would like more of those types of stories. And stories don't have to be just books. They don't have to be movies. There could be video games. There could be different things in different cultural contexts and whatnot that resonate in those ways with more of a what I would call like liberation oriented politics that challenges unfair rulings of politics that has this kind of inherent sense of what is right and what is wrong in one way or another as messy as it is as complicated as the story gets or whatnot, but that's something that at least drives the creator or creators for that matter. That's something I'm more interested in because the alternative I mean, I enjoy it in and of itself, and I've seen the changes it's brought to me personally, and I am someone who acts in the world. So if it changes me in a certain way, it can change the world, to kind of be cheesy about it. But you can scale that up essentially. The alternative to this is a sort of a vision of what the future almost inevitably would look like, which disarms us. We don't tend well, we can't do anything about it. It's all about, very rich people who are going to just be rich forever and control everything and whatnot. We end up believing the stories that they are themselves putting out there, which they need us to believe for their own psychological reasons as well. Like we end up having this vision of the future as like if it gets really bad global warming wise, well, the Peter Thiels of this world will either go to Mars, which is not going to happen, or they'll have those bunkers like the one he bought in New Zealand, or they can be like Mark Zuckerberg who owns his island in Hawaii or whatever it might be, and that this is essentially the future. But what gets interesting in all of those movies is that that future can be penetrated. In Star Wars Andor, the rich people are actually bothered in the sense that they are actually affected and impacted and all of that stuff, and even attacked in some sense. That you're able to kind of penetrate that fortress, if that makes sense, which is how those people, especially the Peter Thiels and Musk and whatnot, is how they perceive the rest of the world as being inherently violent. It's a Hobbesian dog eat dog, whatever, world and whatnot. And having stories that contradict that stories that could even be based in reality, is a way of challenging that. I'll give you a last example.
Mm.
There's a big myth that I don't know how still prevalent it is today around the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in the US.
Mm.
And the myth was the one that was propagated by the media at the time. This was during the Bush years and Bush Junior years and whatnot. That there was like a lot of looting, all of these people coming from outside of New Orleans, coming to take our stuff and all of that stuff. What actually happened, and Rebecca Solnit has a really good book on that. What actually happened most of the time, sure, there were issues and whatnot, is people kind of come together. And that's sort of what happens in most of those situations. It's just interesting and kind of even intellectually to ask, why is it that stories like that are not the ones that populate any kind of like post-apocalyptic, post-disaster, post-catastrophe, post-whatever movies, for example? For the most part, what populates it is that you have the hero A lot of other people die. It's about the hero who's going to do hero stuff, and it's because of his like usually it's a him. It's his personal ingenuity and entrepreneurial spirit or whatever it might be that he's able to save the world, in one
Well,
way or another.
to give another example, a really classic one is Lord of the Flies.
Hmm.
Goldberg? Who wrote Lord of the Flies?
I unfortunately do not remember.
No, neither do I off the top of my head. But anyway, Lord of the Flies is, boys stranded on an island, and absent the restraining power of civilization, man's inner savagery comes out and they turn on each other. That's sort of the rough synopsis. And at the end, they're sort of saved, you know, by a British officer showing up. Not, no, it's not a subtle book. But we have real life instances of schoolboys stranded on desert islands, and almost uniformly the opposite happens. It tends to incentivize cooperation.
Yeah,
Like it tends to become, um, yeah, it tends to really incentivize teamwork and people working together, and actually it bonds people rather than
yeah,
pulls them apart.
yeah,
Um, and that's an interest. But I think most people are, and obviously those two different sort of views of what's intrinsic to human nature and what comes out in these circumstances have political implications,
yeah.
right? And I think most people are walking around with the Lord of the Flies story in their head, even though
Exactly.
that's not actually the story when that literal thing happens.
That's exactly it. That's the point I made about the post-apocalyptic movies, that the
Yeah,
lesson
yeah.
for the most part is that the second things get really bad. It's a, dog eat dog world, which is a funny expression because dogs don't do that. But like it's, or all for
Or,
one,
or, or,
whatever.
or the idea of the alpha male. I don't know
Yes.
anything about wolf behavior, but I am informed by people who do that that is not how wolf packs work.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
And the what was it? Ben Shapiro, the right-wing commentator, whatever in the
Yeah.
US, wrote a fiction, or no, wrote a book. Let me find it for you. It's actually pretty relevant to what we're talking about. Ben Shapiro, Lions, I think. Uh, yeah, so okay. So Ben Shapiro, the right-wing commentator, he wrote a book which was a New York Times bestseller, which tells you a lot about his audience, called
Yeah.
Lions and Scavengers, and which literally
Okay.
the central premise, obviously the lions are them and scavengers are the leftists. I mean, that's pretty obvious. He's very on the nose kind of guy. But the thing about the lions is that lions are scavengers. Lions, when
Yeah.
they hunt, they do hunt, of course, but a lot of what they do is scavenging. Lions also pretty notoriously sleep a lot. That's what they spend a lot of their time doing, just sleeping. And scavengers, like the other animals, the bad ones, like the hyenas and whatnot, some of them also hunt. And so even in the realm of metaphors, even not even the metaphors, even in the realm of like you just have to open Wikipedia and look at what is the behavior of this animal, they don't have that need to make sense, to be like quote unquote logical, to be right. They just have a need to tell a certain story. And that story, in their case, in the case of the right, is pretty straightforward, and not always, but in many ways, especially in the case of Ben Shapiro. There are the good guys and the bad guys. The good guys are entrepreneurial, kind of this Ayn Randian world and whatnot, that are kind of, are often males and they care about whatever. And the bad guys are the ones who just want to take. They just want to take. They're lazy and they just feel like taking. Uh, I want to contradict all of that because, in many ways, that sort of worldview still dominates a lot of what we think of as possible, even in the realm of like politics, even in the realm of discourse, I mean, of policies and whatnot. Like the debates we're having in the UK sometimes make me feel like I'm losing my mind. And I'm using debate very loosely. It's not quite debate in that sense. Of like what is considered possible. Like all of these cuts that they keep on doing and again, like we're going to cut even more, even more, even more. And it's almost like, well, what else are we going to do? Where else can we find money? We cannot think about anything else. And by the way, here's $500 trillion for this weapon or whatever it might be. You know, that there's something fundamentally broken if you think about the UK, I mean, the US as well and whatnot, about the way we, and I'm using we
I'll
broadly.
be controversial and I will say I think the horizons of politics, the Overton window, if you want to use that phrase, is narrower on the left flank in the UK than in the US. I know we like to think
Yes,
of I know we like to think of the US as a conservative country, and it is. There's a real and there's
sure.
strains of conservatism there that we don't have. But, there is a sort of fairly robust progressive liberal voice in the US that there isn't here. And
Yeah.
there's a sort of there's a sort of even though there's a much longer and stronger socialist tradition in the UK, but socialism is mainstreaming in the US. It's still definitely a junior player in the Democratic coalition, no doubt. But Mandami, AOC are part of the Democratic Party in a way that
Hmm.
their equivalents in the UK are not part of the Labour Party anymore.
Absolutely.
You
Absolutely.
know, I think where we draw the line, I mean, the line on the rightward flank is just forever lurching forward into insanity in both
Hmm.
countries. But I would say, and this is one of my more controversial opinions, that the line of possibility or the line of imagination is actually tighter in the UK on our side.
I actually agree with that. That's been my experience anyway of looking of just what is, I think you're the one who even gave that example that are like elements of transphobia in the UK that are
Yeah.
more extreme in, part of the Labour Party than even among some Republicans in the US. Um,
Republican governors have, and not like back in the day, like within the last year, Republican governors have vetoed bathroom bans less extreme than what the EHRC is proposing.
yeah, yeah,
I think that's a reasonably uncontroversial statement. There's maybe other aspects you could get into about transport, but certainly our media covers it more aggressively.
yeah,
So, no, I would actually go to bat for that analogy. It's
I agree.
and that's a case where it's not even, this is a whole other conversation I could get sidetracked in, but it's not even a case of like hypotheticals, but like reality on the ground for what it's like to exist as a trans person in those countries. Certainly, I think like your legal rights are worse in the UK than in a blue state in America, certainly, but
Absolutely.
maybe even in some red states.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's been trans people that I know. I know one person. I won't name names, of course, but she's a trans woman in one of the states in the U.S. and she was looking at the way out and where to go. And we were having conversation at one point, like, have you considered this or this and that? And it was just self-evident that she would not even consider the UK because it
Yeah.
just wouldn't be safe. And the fact that this just happened, like in the sense that it is now the norm. It is just it's already been normalized at like seemingly like light speed, in terms of like what is considered normal and what's not considered normal.
It's So this is something I've written about a bit, and
Hmm.
which I've come to recently. It hasn't been a topic of mine or something I've written about, but I, just decided I wanted to say something about it and did enough research until I felt like I, could say something without embarrassing myself. Because there's always been a strongly anti-LGBT element in American politics because they have a religious right in a way we just don't. I mean that
Hmm.
element there, but it's not powerful in the same way. Whereas, I mean, we forget Theresa May ran on a platform of liberalizing gender transition laws, liberalizing the
Yeah,
2003 Gender Recognition Act less than a decade ago,
yeah,
you know, and the British government issued a travel advisory when North Carolina did their bathroom ban. And again, less than a decade ago, and we're now doing something considerably more. Anyway, that's a whole other story, but it is a
yeah,
very clear
yeah.
instance of where we think of the US as a more conservative country. And it's complicated, but on a lot of fronts, I would want to challenge that
I
narrative.
agree. I agree. I think at the very least, there's more of a like just to stick to even electoral politics. There's more flexibility as to who would be like even if the leaders of the party don't want you, you can still become the Mamdani, for example. Even if
Yeah,
the leaders of the party don't, because of the specific structure of the political system there. Whereas here you don't. If Starmer doesn't like you, you're gone. That's it. I mean, pretty much. And it's very much easier to censor in that sense. It's much easier to control the ranks. It's much easier to like we have how many times have we had either open letters or whatnot from Labour MPs who are very uncomfortable with something that Starmer has said or done, but they are anonymous. Like it's something's fundamentally broken. I mean, it's kind of a different topic here, but clearly it shows
yeah.
that there is a strand of authoritarianism, if you want, here on the center, whatever politics, that in the US at the very least is more flexible, is willing to team up, if not agree, but at the very least team up with people who, someone who would call himself the democratic socialist. And people
I
like to
mean,
win in New York, he had to have the votes of people who do not call themselves democratic socialists because they're not the majority. But
but I'll
it
give
was
you
enough. Yeah.
an even more extreme instance is The Bulwark, which is a centre-right publication owned by, I don't know if owned by, but like it's Bill Kristol's project, who was neocon. He was Dan Quayle's chief of staff. And The Bulwark its politics are very moderate. He's aggressively anti-fascist and aggressively anti-Trump. Like I write for The Bulwark without qualms, you know? I quite like them in some respects, actually. And their view on Mondami was, yeah, cool, sure. Because their view was, okay, there's some policies, I don't know about free buses, I don't know about this like city-owned grocery store thing. But sure, it's not going to like destroy the city. And if this is what it takes to keep the anti-Trump coalition together, is the socialists get a few socialist policies in a deep blue city, cool. you know? And I think then we can look to like, okay, we've got to run someone a bit more moderate when we're trying to retake Ohio or something. Sure. Although actually Sherrod Brown isn't that moderate, but that's another story. And like just a sort of realism about like it has to be all of us. It has to be everyone on the anti-fascist side working together. And that is often leveraged to make lefties shut up and put up with moderates. But what's happened in the US is sometimes the opposite,
Yeah.
is the moderates have said, okay, well, the lefties may not be a majority of the country, but there's still enough of them that will have to have their votes.
Yeah.
And cool, you can have Mandana, you can have your free buses, like
Yep.
we're not going to implement full socialism, but you're part of the coalition. Whereas the
Mm.
response of the Labour Party has been go fuck yourself,
Yeah.
you know? And I don't know. I don't know if as reform continues to rise, if we continue our authoritarian drift, if we do end up in a position where we have a reform government and they start doing, some of the things we see Trump doing with ICE and so on, if you'll see that sort of, I suspect you probably will actually, you'll see that sort of consolidation of liberalism on our side in a way that will open the door to a bit more open-mindedness, but we're
Yeah.
definitely not there yet. Really
No, we're
not.
not there yet. I'm seeing interesting signs around the Green Party and whatnot, but it's nowhere near yet anyway. National level numbers. But it's been faster than I admit in terms of like the popularity in the polls and whatnot. It's been faster than I would have thought it possible at this stage of UK politics. So that's interesting in that sense. But I don't
Yeah,
know where
well,
it goes next, obviously.
in the Politico average of polls, they're tied with Labour at 16%,
Yeah,
which I don't know how much I trust that figure if I'm being honest, but they're doing, I think by any metric, they're doing well relative to expectations.
yeah,
I mean, to maybe bring it back to our topic, you know, Britain has I'm not a sort of starry-eyed nationalist, but I think it is fair to say Britain has a very rich literary and fictional tradition in
sure.
this country. We do have a strong creative tradition. I'm not super knowledgeable about musical history, but even I know a lot of musical innovation has come from our country. It's a big question to end on, but if our political imagination is narrow in this country, as I think we agree it is there some way we can leverage our, not as a silver bullet or a sort of solution to it all? Like I've said, I'm a bit cautious of that sort of narrative, but as you put it, and I like, one tool in the toolkit. Is there a way, specifically in the British context, we can sort of leverage that history and that heritage to just think, to not have to wait until we have a reform government doing roundups to expand our imagination, to maybe sort of get there ahead of that?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. As we said, like it's just another tool in the toolbox, and there's a lot of arguments to be made about like why was it that like the UK had this global, global leading, let's say, musical industry in the 50s and 60s and 70s. A lot of the musicians, including some of the Beatles, for example, would not have existed. Like I think it was Ringo who was very sick, would not have existed without something like the NHS, to give an example. That there is a direct link between being able to why was there kind of this explosion, so to speak, of creative types. And part of the reason, a big part of the reason, is that for the most part, there was a bit more of a social safety net for them now than there would have been, a few generations ago or what have you. Because the type of work that usually an artist wants to do before even it gets famous or popular or what have you, usually, there isn't really a return on investment in that sense, and there may never be. And you cannot necessarily operate under that logic because you just don't know whether there would be ever, like whether you can make money out of it, especially these days. But if there is more of a social safety net, then there is something more of that story. And I think a lot of when the Olympics happened in London, part of the opening ceremony was very much like, we're the country. There's problematic stuff like erasing empire and whatnot, but we're the country of the NHS, and that was kind of this big, big thing. That was an interesting moment that the right clearly was very infuriated by, because it's like, oh, we're this entity that has all of these different parts of the world in us because of our history, obviously, and this has enriched us. It's not a bad thing. It is quite literally a good thing. In
Mm.
order to tell that story, we need to be able to imagine certain things. Like, are we imagining certain characters? Do certain stories come to mind and whatnot? And if not, I think this is part of, not again, not everything, but it is part of the work to do. Like, why is that? Like, I know that when the Queen died, like a few years ago, among the things that people were doing was like leaving marmalade sandwiches outside, which was not ideal because it was polluting, but we're doing so. And the reason for that is because of Paddington Bear. And it's like,
Mm.
the reason why they were remembering a real human monarch with like this history behind her, controversial, people were debating it, all of that stuff, sure. But they were remembering her through a fictionalized Peruvian refugee bear.
Mm.
Is because of the resonance of the movie that came out, and how that kind of that gave them a certain, how it made them feel. Let's put it that way. It's not rational putting marmalade sandwich outside. It's not rational to think of a fictionalized bear, but it is in that story. Even if you think of Paddington, where he's quite literally a refugee, paperless. He didn't undocumented, coming from Peru, didn't speak English because obviously he was from Peru, and then became quintessentially English and British. And meets the Queen and whatever. And there is a way of telling these stories. Paddington, with all of its fault, whatnot. It's just an example that even at the time, like 10 years ago, we're talking about 10, 15 years ago, there was a bit more of an appetite of telling a story about us, the UK, that was kind of positive. That like we are going somewhere that's good somehow, or whatnot. And again, this can be picked apart and challenged and critiqued, and it's not all perfect and whatnot. But if you put that and you kind of contrast it with what are the dominant stories today, it's like who can be more cruel? Who can have like
Mm.
in a ASMR read video that they release on X, of like arresting someone or deporting someone or doing some kind of raid against whatnot, and that actually becomes like almost an end in itself. And you're seeing today labor like basically like competing with how can they actually be more cruel? Should we take their jewelry now? We're going to now strip away their the subsidies, and we're going to kick them out of those hotels or what have you. This is a far right discourse. This is like they have conceded to the far right effectively. And a part of the problem, it's not the only problem, but a part of the problem is that when I see this being challenged, whether it's on like BBC Question Time or like in the news or online or what have you, not always, but a lot of the time. In fact, Zach Polanski has been relatively refreshing on that front. But a lot of the times, the problem, so to speak, is taken for granted. Like, yes, we do have a problem of migration, rather than like, do we? Do we have a problem of migration? Because the answer is kind of no. And but also
We
all of these
actually have
things
a
that are
problem of overly restrictive systems.
exactly. And
Yeah.
then the things that are obvious that are then talked about but completely divorced from migration, like, oh, we have a healthcare crisis, we have a care crisis, or we have an aging population, all of that stuff that can actually be resolved, not entirely, but like to some extent, with just better migration, like just more migration and more regulated if you want or whatnot, but just more as well. Where is that story? Where is it being told? It's not being told by the ruling party, that is supposedly the one that replaced the conservative. Obviously, by conservatives and reform, they're just competing with one another and with Labour in many ways to see who can sound more right wing. Where is the alternative? Where is the thing that's talking about like, well, what if we don't do that? That doesn't seem like a good thing. And maybe you're lying about this. Why is no one accusing them of lying to say to their face? Some of it is cultural, some of it is like, well, this lack of confrontation that we see in British culture and whatnot. Another part of it is like, we don't, and we, people who challenge them don't seem to necessarily know what is it that they want. Like, what is
Mm.
your vision of the UK or what have you? Because they have a vision of the UK. It's pretty clear. It's pretty straightforward of what their vision of the UK is. Where's ours? In that sense. And I do think in that sense, there's a role to be played of like how do we populate, how do we encourage those types of stories? And as I said, stories can be taken in very different ways because it does make a difference if it does make a difference on a cultural level, it doesn't have to, but it could affect politics. And when there isn't that at all, when you don't have like if you I think of Iran, which is a country I'm very fascinated by, when they destroyed the movie theaters after the Islamic Revolution, why the fuck would they do that? Like there's something to it. There's something to it that bothers them, that threatens them, that really, why are they banning certain books in the US and stuff like that? If it's just books, you know? It's because it does actually, in their minds, the way they perceive it, it affects the youth. It changes the youth. It influences the youth, by which they mean it makes them think. And that's
Mm.
what they're concerned by. That's what they're uncomfortable with. So
No, that's great. Let's leave it there. We ran over a bit, but that was good. Thank you so much for your time. But listeners who might want to follow you or read your work, Blue Sky handle, website, anywhere you'd like to direct them.
I'm not that active on social media most of the time, but I do have a newsletter called hauntologies.net. So as in hauntings, but hauntologies. And my podcast is called The Fire These Times. I try and be active on both of those. And sometimes I write elsewhere, but usually I archive them there in one way or another, or I talk about them in different places.
Awesome. Cheers, mate.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.